Well, welcome everyone to the combined BCSC Board of Directors, the BCSC Federal Policy Committee, and the Clean Energy Business Network. Thank you, Lynn. This is our luncheon meeting. As Lisa mentioned, the video will be, this event will be video recorded. Everyone's asked to use the microphones that are in front of you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And those participating in the webcast are invited to ask questions by emailing CEBN President Lynn Abramson. That email address, if you don't have it handy, is labramson, that's LABRAMSON @cebn.org.
So as Mark mentioned, we have a two-part event prior to the BCSC board meeting. We're very pleased to have some Federal Policy Committee members joined with some board members for the discussion. We've been looking forward to having Tom Hassenboehler come and speak with us about the initiative that he and Tom Lawler and other colleagues of his started, I don't know, a year or so ago now. Very productive year. So we're going to hear a couple things from Tom. We're going to hear about ECMAP and their recent products, but we're also hopeful that he'll join the conversation with Liam Donovan at our second segment of this meeting to talk about the elections. And again, welcome to any CEBN members that might be joining us. So the Business Council for Sustainable Energy had the opportunity to work with Tom quite extensively when he served as Chief Counsel for the Energy Environment Committee at the U.S. House of Representatives at the Energy and Commerce Committee. He served under Chairman Fred Upton and Greg Walden. So, but in addition to working with him on very specific legislation, we certainly have looked to you, Tom, as somebody who has the pulse on, bipartisan opportunities on energy, environment, and infrastructure issues. So I think for many of us, that's why we're so excited that you started ECMAP. We have several members that are either directly involved on your steering committee. I'll mention Mary Ann Brown of Semper Energy, but there are others in the mix, and we hope more will come to it because it is really an exciting prospect for us, both for policy and for market development. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and your slides should be right after this very handsome picture, I must say. Full with the beard. Yeah. So somewhat up to date. And, we'll just take, 15, 20 minutes and have some opening comments from you and have the remainder of our time for discussion.
That'd be great. I'm going to let Tom Lawler talk first.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for having us here, Lisa. I'm Tom Lawler. And I've actually had the joy of working with Lisa and Laura Tierney quite a bit over the last couple of years. When I was an independent consultant, and I worked a lot with AIDA, and I still do, but we got to do a lot of fun stuff with particularly with COPs and various other things. So I've seen a number of you in various venues in that perspective. On Tom's picture, I will say you could put one of those bus advertisements taken with an iPhone, because that's actually just on the on the balcony of our building. Just took it out. We're like, we need pictures for our website. There you go. It helps to be photogenic, I guess. So a year ago, Tom and I and our other partner Cameron, we started Coefficient, and it's not kind of your run-of-the-mill GR shop. We definitely are much more of a public policy shop, and we bring our own kind of, I would say, biases or opinions to the table about what we want to accomplish with our practice. And there's a couple of, we started with just a couple of pillars. One being the new digital revolution, if you will, and kind of the role of data in public policy. And then finance. My partner Cameron does a lot of sustainable finance, and what are the public policy tools for lowering the cost of capital for myriad projects. But that's really what it comes down to, is lowering the cost of capital for renewable energy and clean energy and the transition economy. And then the third kind of perspective is that we've all been through the climate wars in various perspectives, or in other environmental regulatory battles and legislation and regulatory. And where we are today is we've seen significant improvements in CO2 emissions and efficiency and others, and most of those, if not a significant portion of them, have been market-driven outcomes rather than kind of market-based regulatory outcomes. And so those kind of three pillars have given us this theory of an empowered consumer is what will enable further market-driven environmental outcomes. And a lot of and Tom will talk a lot about the opportunities from data. Data doesn't have any virtues in and of itself, and we can read the paper over the past week and see how big data groups have been utilizing data to commoditize the consumer. But it does have the potential to allow consumers to commoditize their data and really provide I think data can enable transparency, and transparency is what can enable the consumer. And so those are kind of our theories, our business theories that we bring to the table when we're looking at public policy and things of that sort. And 6 months ago, based on with that kind of theory, Tom started ECMAP with the idea of what are the public policy barriers or opportunities for leveraging these digital tools on behalf of the consumer. So with that, Tom, I'll let you kind of go from there.
Thank you. And thanks, Lisa, again, for having us. I really appreciate the invite and to get to talk to you all about these issues. A little bit, let me get that picture off and now move to us. So what, why are we here? What did we form this for? A little bit of it stems from my personal experience being on the Hill the last couple of years. I've been doing this for about 15 years, working with the committees both in the Senate and the House. There was always kind of like this. We used to think big in DC, and we used to be able to do big things like big energy policy bills. I kind of grew up doing EPAC 2005 into the 2007. We ran right into that. We had divided Congress. We actually did some things. Then we ran right into cap and trade debates and policy. It was exciting, and then we just got in a rut. There was just absolutely nothing happening in Congress. It was a drip. We got excited over small appropriation riders. I mean, this is basically how bad it's become. And going back to the Hill, when I went back for Fred Upton, I said, don't bring me on unless you want to start to think big again and try to do some big things. Little did I know how difficult that would be to start to achieve that. We came close. There was, as you know, a Senate energy bill that was done in a bipartisan way, in a very productive way. But due to a lot of sort of things beyond the control of us, and a lot of inertia just about how broken the process is, we weren't able to get that over the finish line. And there was also something to be said about what was in that bill, or lack of things in that bill. It was almost like we were doing stuff just to say we could do it again, and that got very disenchanting for people that actually came to Congress to do big things. And so with that kind of backdrop, I really wanted to kind of create a fresh forum to talk about some of these issues that have been really beleaguering our policy development at the intersection of climate, at the intersection of energy policy, digital technologies, consumer empowerment, free markets. These are the things that we're all kind of talking about in our silos, but I feel no one's really tried to bring them together in a way that actually is framed around the consumer and framed around exactly what is leading to this discussion, and it's about data. Data really is driving things in ways that I think we can only imagine at this stage. There's a lot being said about this, and people that have been operating in the state level. I just came from NARUC last week, and gave a similar presentation, and these folks have been on the front lines with AMI rollout and smart meter data, personal data. This is all very state-centric issues. At the federal level, outside of the 2009, we were doing some of the bills to push that out, and some of the the stimulus packages. We really have not been involved in these issues, and so what's happening, you know, is there's tons and tons of data being generated now, not just at the residential level, but further upstream in the process. And many of you are, you know, building the equipments and the ability to monitor that data, track that data, sense, you know, to be able to sense it, put it in meters. But no one's really talking about collectively what that does for the markets and for consumers. I mean, I give a couple of points about, and this is things that I'm learning just as I go through these issues. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every 24 hours. That's just all across the board. What does that actually mean to people? Google conducts by the minute 3,607,000 searches. Uber riders take 45,787 rides a minute. YouTube users watch over 4 million videos a minute. You get the idea. 90% of that world's data is produced in the last 2 years alone, so it's truly exponential in nature where we're going with this stuff. You know, really just the number of connected devices is just kind of mind-blowing. But what does it really mean to energy? And you know, we operate in our silos in Washington, a lot of us, and even within our own companies. And I find that there's not enough process about looking at this stuff for the opportunities that it creates to really transform some of the political climate around these energy policy issues that data and an empowered consumer, as Tom Lawler said, can really produce. You know, there's, you know, a lot of you know this, and you probably have better statistics than I do about, you know, how many connected devices are going to be online by 2020, or, you know, but it's really about that production and discovery of the new resource of data, and making it into a seamless process for the consumer that we're really talking about. How do we integrate that? That's going to take not just state level leadership, it's going to take some federal leadership. And obviously there's a lot of discussions about, you know, privacy and data being discussed for the next Congress, and, you know, what's California doing and how we're going to preempt that and all that. Does that really get into the granularity of how energy regulatory and environmental systems are working? No, it doesn't. And my point is we need to have a conversation to get that started, and it's going to take a lot more than you know, one person doing this. We're going to have to really make this much more of a coordinated effort. You know, when we talk about, you know, sensors and data being collected, you know, a lot of folks say, well, this just makes life more complicated, or, you know, if you don't come from, if you're not below the age of 30, you know, you may not, you know, care about any of this stuff. But actually, you know, I think the technology is proving those folks wrong too. I mean, you know, there's new services that are being generated by this data. I mean, you know, even my own parents use Uber. You know, they all go on Airbnb now, and they were the same ones that said we would never use this 3 to 5 years ago. So I'm sure you all have experiences like that can be translated. When we talk about for energy data, you know, how do you actually differentiate data? That's what we're actually talking about. The ability for data to drive and commoditize market risk and climate risk, which is what, you know, you all work on and what we want to work on, and what's been really holding back. How do these suite of technologies, how does blockchain and artificial intelligence and IoT allow real-time, seamless access to this kind of data pools that are being generated further upstream, and how can they be customized to the consumer experience to give them what they want? I mean, they either want, if they want clean, we want to give them clean. We want to be able to translate that into an actual market distinction that can actually be translated all the way from the consumer to the end user, to the upstream experience. And there's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of problems with that statement that are inherent in just the nature of the way our regulatory architectures are constructed in the country. And what the point of ECMAP is to start that kind of fresh forum discussion about that. How do we enable consumers to get what they want? Do they want affordable? Do they want local? Again, the consensus process of building people together in order to not have this top-down centric vision, but actually a bottoms-up approach to enabling climate and abilities to value things. So digital measurement, reporting, and verification tools are really what we're going to be focused on. You know, we have examples throughout regulatory processes, and I'll talk about some of the white papers we've already put out about how you measure, report, monitor, and verify emissions through data-centric processes. But at the federal level, really, you know, you go talk to EPA, you go talk to the White House, you go talk to even Congress, they don't seem to translate how these tools can actually enhance a regulatory process that is in dire need of updating, both from a permitting efficiency side or from a traceability side, all the way to just being able to cut government spending. I mean, a free market advocate could be just as for this as a transparency advocate who wants to know more about what's going into the permitting process for a natural gas pipeline. There's absolutely metrics and data that can be collected now that are not being at least thought through at the federal level on how we do this. And ultimately, it's about creating that unique customer experience that consumers really want to be able to differentiate in their data. So what is ECMAP doing? Our mission really is to align public policy with the digital energy future. So we're talking about empowering consumers, supporting free and fair markets, enabling innovation, driving that transparency for that informed decision-making process to occur, not in a more complicated way, but in a more seamless way. And this is for industrial consumers all the way down to the residential consumer level. You've got abilities for people to really to really get more engaged in the products and the systems that you all sell and that you all build. What we need is creating that venue to talk about where government needs to get out of the way, but also where government needs to be enhanced and really focused on some of those areas. And I think now my slide thing doesn't work, unfortunately. So we may just, yeah, that's all right. So if we can, we'll move to the next slide. I'll pause. It did move? Yeah, there we go. That's the next one. That's good. So what are the things that we're going to be doing? I mentioned a little bit about dividing up our issues into. I'll go back. I got it. It works now. Yep, I got it. Non-regulatory and regulatory issues, kind of how we think about this in Washington, and Lisa can attest to some of the at our first couple of events. We had in the audience a pretty diverse crew. We had folks from the Heritage Foundation and even CEI and some of the right groups sitting next to some of the folks from environmental justice groups and some of the the far left groups that have not really sat in the same room in a long time. And I think they were all intrigued by what we're doing, how we're talking about data, how we're talking about this kind of populist consumer experience. And on the regulatory side, it's like, okay, how can we enable more seamless integration of these new digital tools, everything from sensing and AI and software solutions that are going to potentially accelerate some of the permitting challenges and increase transparency, to the non-regulatory side, where I'm excited about too, from more of a market-driven libertarian perspective. How do we actually drive more data into commodity markets? How do we get that climate risk disclosure process much more centralized, much more methodical, so it's not a shaming mechanism that it's been used in the past, and that it's actually driven, now we can get into granularity a lot more, and you all are, some of you are building the tools to do that. How do we start having a much bigger conversation about this that isn't infringed upon by sort of the stigmas and the things that have held us back on these? Framing it is very important, and I learned that on the Hill too. The way you frame things, the way you talk about them, can bring a much different conversation that may have the same outcome as another way of framing it in a much more top-down centric version. So our activities are really going to focus on these. I mean, we've done a couple of white papers that I'll just go to this first that have set the stage. So year one, as Lisa and Tom said, we really used year one to just kind of start a process that we just wanted to survey the landscape. So we've done two big scene setting white papers. We call this kind of like creating the ecosystem of things that we wanted to talk through. We model some of the statutes in there. We think big about some of the ideas. We're not afraid to ask the hard questions. We don't just say all we can agree on is this one thing and let's just put a band-aid on it. We actually go to the heart of a lot of these things in these papers. We had a couple of events with some members of Congress, Senate and Hill staff. At our last power sector event, we had the FERC commissioners, Commissioners Chatterjee and Glick, and we had a state commissioner. We had some new technologies combined with the consumer advocates. We had a really robust discussion about privacy and how much choice do consumers really want. And so what we're going to do is build on that process in the next year to really roll up our sleeves and start working on some actual where can we start to align this conversation and build out an actual policy agenda for a future Congress. And looking at regulatory and non-regulatory pathways, there's tons of issues that we need to start to talk about. Amongst them primarily is data, and how do you talk about data in a way that actually doesn't kind of put everybody in their silos, but looks at this from where do you need to elevate the role of the consumer? Obviously, if you're going to have more data, you're going to have more service providers, third-party access to these issues. A consumer advocate would say you need to elevate the role of consumer protection and equity. You know, there's also barriers to doing that. On the non-regulatory side, you need market rules and standards. You know, there's just new energy services that can be developed, digital tools to do this. There's certainly not a lack of things to get done. And so our paper kind of really talks about that. And our third one is really, you know, we're trying to frame the entire energy system here. So we wanted to talk to make sure we don't miss the opportunity on industrials. Obviously, there's tons of work being done on supply chains and, you know, new green industrial processes, differentiated gas, and, you know, mining. And so working with stakeholders around these issues and some of these statutes, again, these are hard, old statutes that are clearly not up to the challenge of operating in this kind of environment. And, you know, we need to call that out, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that. And I think the members of Congress will understand that if you frame it the right way and you're not afraid to say some of these things need to get changed. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's going to take a long time, but if you don't start asking the question, it's never going to happen. Our process, just a little bit, you know, this kind of explains where we've been so far this year. You know, when I left, I'm working with our partners, the Keystone Policy Center. They've done, you know, back in the day, they used to do a lot of old-fashioned convenings where they would do stakeholder processes. We would bring in a diverse set of folks, and we'd really develop some actual convenings and then some actual outcome-oriented documents with guidance and principles all the way into that can translate into legislative policies, kind of like the days of like Blue Ribbon Task Force and, you know, things that we used to do. We used to think big about, you know, what kind of Blue Ribbon Commission on Energy Policy can we create? Or why don't we do something on digital policy? So that really is our goal. You know, we're going to use these white papers and this framing network to really build out a digital energy blueprint for policymakers. You know, starting where we are at the bottom of that arrow with framing these white papers. And now we're going to move into our building vision activities. I mean, this is really the kickoff year next year. You know, working with folks like BCSC, we want to be able to engage. We want to figure out ways to partner on certain things. You know, we want to bring that added value to folks to be able to, and a focused perspective on these issues that I don't think exist anywhere in DC yet. And certainly at the state level, there's a lot of initiatives as I'm learning. I mean, there's data, mission data, there's data initiatives all across the state processes. But again, connecting this dot to further upstream data and how that's going to transform not just electricity wholesale markets, but supply chains and, you know, federal issues is absolutely needed. And I haven't really seen a coherent focus on this beyond that. So, you know, we're not going to take on every challenge at once. We may decide to just do, here's like 10 data principles that need to be inherent in not everything that we do across transportation, across power, across industrials. We may decide to take on a few targeted efforts depending on, you know, the interest of folks and the interest of our participants as we build this out. So, you know, we're really in the ground floor formation stage. And so I would welcome a follow-up dialogue with you on what are the most urgent issues that we should be focusing on. We want to take, you know, we've talked to some of the governors and the state and the PUCs and, you know, taking some of their harder issues, and we would dissect them a little bit more and actually bring about some things that are causing them some roadblocks. So then we can eventually educate Congress on these issues, educate the states on that. So that's really what we're about. I mean, I'm personally very motivated by this and excited about it. I believe in it. I think it can be transformative. I think it's going to be hard and challenging, of course, but that's the point. You know, we want to take these things on, and we're not afraid to make that happen. So I welcome a larger dialogue on it and look forward to working with you all as we go into next year. So.
Thanks, Tom. Excuse me, Mark Wagner, Johnson Controls. One of the things that I think, I don't know if it'll be a challenge, but it'll certainly be something we'll watch next year, is it appears it looks like we're going to have some data privacy legislation working its way through Congress. And where these two kind of intersect, I think it's, you know, going to be really important that we don't inadvertently put a chill on, our ability to compile data just because we've got, you know, individual privacy concerns for whatever. I mean, I think we got to balance the two. In striking that right balance, I'd interesting to hear from you.
Kind of talk about it as like, you know, we got to separate the data streams out a little bit. I mean, again, like, you don't want to go into a personal conversation where you're going into auto data or inside the home data. I mean, yes, if third parties get access to, you know, when people are turning on their microwaves and fridges and things, you know, there's a question that, you know, there's certainly an ability to, you know, to figure out privacy issues and where the lines can be drawn, and, you know, what kind of disclosure do you need, what kind of, you know, what kind of upfront warnings do you need to give the consumer. So that's a can of real issues that have been discussed a lot at the state level, as you know. And so I don't want to ignore that, but I also want to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity to talk about the further industrial emissions data, process data, like taking data from like the toxic release inventory or greenhouse gas inventory, all this analog style data that's being collected over the years. We have now new nodes and access points for data that is like beyond comprehension for people that can actually, if they want to open their minds to see what that can do to transform the experience of an end use buyer. I mean, a utility who wants to differentiate their gas. That's a different data conversation than a residential consumer. So we have to make sure that we, in the laws, we don't get so sweeping that we sweep some of that kind of stuff in that collection of data. You know, so there's going to have to be an energy-centric conversation if there's going to be a Washington-centric privacy conversation next year. So that may be very well one of the first things that we start to make sure we're a voice for, you know, and don't forget this opportunity here. And, you know, my guess is we haven't done polling, but a lot of people would welcome a conversation about using, you know, getting more information about their data, just like when they buy organic foods, they can go and figure out a way. You know, they can pay 99 cents for their styrofoam eggs at Walmart, or they can go pay $6 a dozen at Whole Foods. It's their choice. And now, how do they get the information that goes into that product? Well, those guys should get more, you know, granular in how they do it too. Maybe you can, you know, click on your phone on a little hash and find the chicken that laid the egg. You know, I mean, who knows? But it's the same kind of theme that you want to do for energy if you want to be able to create that value proposition. I think starting with the industrials and the larger consumers first are to have this broader metadata conversation, and hopefully the chilling effect of the privacy stuff doesn't get into the residential side. So it's going to be a tough issue. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the thinking you've been doing, with a lot of different nodes here.
Yeah.
Couple of questions. One is, clearly one of the challenges you have is to focus. Because there's so many different directions you could go, and the key to success with a startup is to show a milestone achieved and so forth. What I'm wondering is, if you could find a wonderful killer app that everybody said, wow, that was fairly simple to do, right? So that you could show a lot of progress, get a lot of PR and all that, raise some money that way. I think it might be helpful. The other kind of question I had, Tom, was who do you see as your primary first or second or third client? Who's going to write the check? How do you monetize what you're doing?
So, I mean, I think there's, I really wanted to start a relationship with both the startups world that need help. We've had in our papers, we highlight, kind of like what we have going on today. Like, here's pilot projects or here's demonstrations that are actually happening right now. And then here's a world just 5 years from now that could happen if some of these barriers were to potentially be reduced in theory. And so we have those, but we also don't want to ignore the big players. I mean, and so we've had conversations with, the big tech folks who are building this kind of software and who understand the market and business opportunity, but haven't yet necessarily translated into the energy space. On a B2B level, they're developing contracts with utilities and others, but I don't think they've captured the imagination of the consumer and the broader energy vision yet about what the potential that some of these, like, artificial intelligence. Microsoft has a huge, program that they're building for nature and for, you know, Google has similar things. You've got, you know, different players. I mean, Siemens and all these folks that are doing this stuff, Johnson Controls. But again, like, it gets lost in the silos, I think, sometimes too. I agree with you, finding like a killer like example that can just be like the oh wow moment for everybody. You know, there is a couple of those that I've encountered already. I mean, and to me, with my natural gas experience, I mean, that is, I think, one of the most interesting applications of this is when we talk about granular data, is taking sensor data and meter data, putting it onto a platform and allowing an actual digital transaction of gas to occur between an end use buyer and an upstream provider. So basically having a system where nodes are being collected and meter data is being granularly dissected almost through an algorithm that can differentiate the methane content of the gas at a particular pad or well, and then being able to, in theory, in a synthetic way, being able to actually customize that data into a transaction. You got a lot of barriers to that, but at least you're starting a conversation about actually sending market signal.
Yeah, if I'd be allowed a follow-up, follow-up question, sir. It's sort of dicey these days in Washington, but if you could have a distributor, have a natural gas distributor customer, and find out where the system is leaking, and you know, through all these data nodes, and then say, hey, I will solve this problem because and I'll get paid for it on the basis of how much gas I could save you guys. You know, that would be sort of a self-licking ice cream cone.
No, I totally agree. That's a win-win, and that's a non-regulatory solution that a free market person should like as much as, you know, an environmental group.
The slide, you'll see that this that well pad on the right side of the slide in the list of all the data. Now that's an actual well pad that has been put on a data platform, and every well pad, pretty much every well pad is capturing huge amounts of data about what's coming out of the well. And so this one company is taking that data from from the wellhead to the gathering station and capturing from just the existing sensors.
And meter.
And the meters for, you know, royalties and things of that sort. And they're able to give you per MCF, each MCF they can tag and tell you this was the leakage rate of that, right? This is how much came out of the wellhead. This is how much got to the gathering station. And you can tag all the environmental attributes of that MCF of gas. What type of water was produced? What was done with the water? Was it a green completion? Where is it located? And all this type of stuff. Then it goes into the gathering station and just kind of like it goes into the ether almost. And then at the other end, you know, somebody is burning those molecules somewhere. That is, at this point in time, maybe in the next month, that data company will be finalizing its first big transaction. This is a major oil producer, has about 6,000 wells on the platform, and will be actually selling not just the gas, but the environmental attributes of that gas. I think next month we'll probably close the first deal. But that's right. That's the beginning point and the end point, and then you know it's kind of like that far side. You know, then magic happens and something happens in the middle. So
that's an example.
To your point, that's an example of how
like,
all you need to do is the data is probably already there in terms of being captured at various sensors throughout the pipeline. It's just who gets it, put it into a place, into some sort of way to utilize it, and then it becomes, instead of a commodity, right? Right now, if your gas is you're nothing but briny water, and you're dumping into the river next to you, and you're spewing 6% of the methane out, that gas that comes out is selling for the exact same amount as the gas that's being captured and all that. And so turning those commodities into products is really kind of the market-driven opportunity.
Market-driven, and the supply chain and beyond gas. I mean, that's what our third paper will be getting more granular into those issues too. So I think that critical minerals, conflict-free, how do you trace these things all the way up? Disclosure about these products. I mean, but again, in more bottoms-up, not top-down centric ways. So that's how at least I'm able to have a conversation with the free market groups as well at the same time.
Well, we clearly need more time with the two of you. I know that there might be some questions that we're getting from our participants that we will share with you, because I don't think we're going to have a chance to go through those questions. But I want to take it back maybe to the federal policy. I mean, there's many aspects of what you've discussed that really excite me and intrigue me. I'm going to go back now to kind of where we started, which is, you know, the need to update market rules, and in particular at the federal level. I think a real benefit that you can provide, and that wouldn't only be for federal, is really this unpacking the layers between where the energy markets have their own challenges and then where IoT kind of fits in and what world it's living in, and trying to provide those layers to policymakers, because I don't, right now that doesn't exist. I agree with you. But going back to maybe more of a conventional view of what Congress might look at in the first session, you know, we hear a lot of talk about infrastructure. So clearly some of your policy recommendations could potentially fit into that conversation, in addition to the data privacy legislation. But then even things like, you know, research and development and deployment initiatives at DOE or in other places. So there will be things that are actionable in the short term, where the products of the work you're doing and the work we might be able to do collaboratively would have a home. And then I think we will have a refreshed conversation on environmental issues. And I think a lot of the market transparency benefits and conversation that you can share will maybe open doors to things that couldn't be possible otherwise, that we can break down some of this divide on a partisan basis. So I guess my question to you is, as you're talking broadly to all these different groups, are you getting a sense that, you know, kind of IoT and data is a breakthrough to get people to come around the table and have this conversation, because it's just so attractive and so obvious in people's lives, and they know it's not going away, so they're more compelled? Whereas with the energy conversation, it seems to be, because it's hard and there's so many different interests, it's easy to put it away. You know, so we were successful in building, you know, from 2000 to the 2005 and 2007 legislation, but we haven't been able to really make a lot of progress since then. And I'm wondering, is this the door opener to have conversations that are, you know, more concrete and action oriented?
I hope so. I mean, I think those are all great points. You know, I think to those who want to have the conversation, but I'll be honest, it's hard. And I was a victim of it too. I mean, you know, put these issues in kind of silos. And so I didn't Energy and Commerce, we have a whole subcommittee devoted to these issues on, you know, it's called the subcommittee on, you know, I forget what they call it, the digital commerce now. I mean, it's like they actually changed the name last year. And my guess is Frank Pallone is going to keep something similar along those lines. It's very bipartisan. So, you know, in the energy world, I think people are talking about it, but I don't think, unless we're trying to paint the picture of the opportunity, I think we have to do that. You have to have a little bit of an imagination. You have to have a little bit of a foresight to think this way. And I think once they do it, they say, oh, I get it. So I think it is a good open door to have the conversation, but I haven't seen it like kind of broadened into this potential that could actually be this, like, you know, collaborative connecting voice yet. And so I think the transparency issues in particular that you mentioned are very key to bringing people together, and I think they resonate with like the extremes of both sides too. I mean, there's a very kind of a populist right to know type of attitude about this, and it can be good and bad. I mean, corporates, it creates new risks, but it also, those risks need to be managed too, and that's a conversation about the role of government and how it needs to evolve. I mean, that's really what we want to have, you know, is like, it's not all bad. It's not all rolling back. There are going to be some things that need to be enhanced. And so I tell my free market friends that you're going to have that conversation too, but, you know, you can't just say no to everything. And so that's the hope that we can do for this process.
Right. And then the slide you had where you had, I'm looking at the environmental regulatory agenda, you had like, you know, 5 really critical landmark environmental laws, and none of them have really had an opportunity to be refreshed in this new environment, not just to mention the energy transformation, but also energy plus digitization. So, I mean, look forward to working with you.
Yeah, it's
and,
gonna be fun.
you know,
Look forward to it too.
we're really pleased that we have some board members and other members that are involved already at the ground floor, but think of us as a resource, and, you know, we will be having further conversations.
We're just getting started, yeah. So we're trying to crystallize on a couple of concrete things to do in the first 6 months, year is really what we want to have a conversation about. So that'd be great.
Great.
One quick point of clarification onto the question of like who's the client for ECMAT. ECMAP is a
C3.
C3
Yeah, we're
think
nonprofit.
tank, and
Oh.
its intent is to
So-
be a
sorry.
forum for people to come and talk through this. It's
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
and so even though we you've gotten some sponsors, it's not a, they don't get to tell us what we're going to write or what the outcome
If
is.
you
They
believe in
wanna
this
know
process,
this is a conversation. So that's
right.
there's not a client for ECMAP.
Yeah.
There is a community
process.
for ECMAP to have a conversation.
Right.
Now, if you want to, clients, you can come talk to Coefficient, but I just want to make sure you understand it's intended to be kind of an open forum for
Yeah.
all different sides to try and hash out some of these.
Kind of like a VPC for digital tech and energy. We're a forum. We want to create a forum. Foundation funding as well as corporates, but it's not it is that kind of organizing C3 effort where we're going to have a process and a collaborative stakeholder process to develop some joint, a fresh, transparent forum to eventually educate Congress and the right policymakers on these issues.
Good. Well, again, we look forward to working with you and having further conversations. So I think we're going to now go to the second part, and we hope you'll be able to stay at least for a little bit. We'd love to have your thoughts as we get into the discussion part. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Wagner, our chair, to introduce our next speaker.
Yep. Liam, thank you. Welcome. Liam Donovan is with Bracewell, and he develops advocacy strategies for clients in the tax, the infrastructure, and the energy arena. I was hoping you'd kind of come here and talk about something that we'd be interested in. I'm just kidding. No, so we are really glad you're here. And really helps those clients guide through public policy issues. Prior to that, he was with the Associated Builders, Contractors, and had certainly Hill and Senate experience with the National Republican Senatorial Committee. So we're really glad to have you here, and looking forward to your outlook post-election.
Just one quick comment. Thank you, Liam, for joining us. This is the third time you're joining us. In a few months, you spoke at our Federal Policy Committee and at our State Policy Committee. So we're really grateful for your time and sharing your expertise. And everybody, you are in for an excellent presentation and discussion. So thanks for being here.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. And it's interesting because I feel like we talked through a lot of these issues, and based on 2016 and how everything we thought was wrong, there was no real certainty as to how the outcome was going to be. And I think I feel pretty good. I don't know how much overlap there is among this crowd versus today or the previous iteration. But I think that was one of the themes that I took away from this election. It was sort of conventional wisdom strikes back. After 2 years of questioning everything from whether polls still worked to whether Nate Silver is just wrong about everything, I think there was some vindication for that sort of thing. The data is right, the polling is right, and things turned out about the way we expected, which kind of ended up being an underwhelming night on election night. If you were rooting for Democrats, it was sort of like, this is supposed to be bigger, right? And part of that is that on election night returns, it didn't fully bake in the broader sort of avalanche that happened. Probably 10 seats came in and have shifted in the 2 weeks since the election. But as the dust has settled, and it still hasn't, they're still counting votes out in California and other places, but it has turned into about what we thought the sort of consensus range of the high 30s for Democratic House pickups. Republicans gained ground a little bit and held the Senate. And I think we can unpack a little bit what happened today and what it's going to mean going forward. I think the other thing that stands out to me is that this is sort of, we grapple every 8 years or so, we oscillate between hating gridlock and hating whatever the parties do when we give them power. It's happened in the last 4 decades. It's happened in the last 4 administrations. They get 2 years to sort of put their agenda into some form, and we tend to we can't stand the excess just as much as we can't stand the gridlock. So we're going back into divided government. We're going to get a taste of that, and I think, especially heading into a presidential cycle, this will be 2 years where not a ton gets done, not a lot happens, but a lot of this will be setting the stage for the battle we're about to have. Of course, 2 weeks after 2018, we're already talking about 2020, but I think you can't really consider the policy and politics without keeping that in mind. I think we'll go through the elections a little bit, but I think the way I look at how they impact the policy and what we're all doing here is sort of three lanes. There's the messaging proposals and legislation. There's the oversight that the Democrats will now be able to bring to bear on the administration and on Republicans. And there's the things that can actually get done. And the first two stand in a little bit of tension with the third. What can happen depends in some part. There can be some compartmentalization, but especially with this president, what can be signed into law is going to have to do with the working relationship that is impacted by what the messaging and the oversight, kind of complicates. So I think this is what the map looks like, and the dark spots are where things flipped, and it's concentrated in exactly the places you expect, particularly in the suburbs. I call it the Whole Foods wave. If this is Democrats made their money in those districts that have, there were a couple with an urban core, but mostly the sort of inner ring suburbs, highly educated, particularly with college-educated women, really repelled by this president and the party. If you look at where the 23 seats that Democrats needed, there were 25 districts that were won by Hillary Clinton that they were sort of shooting at. That was the sort of roadmap to 218. They won 21 of those 25 seats. They might pick up a 22nd. Like I said, California is still counting votes, and David Valadao is now within like a whisker of losing that seat. So 21 of 25, that gets them almost all the way to that 23 I mentioned. I think the next tier of seats that you saw them go after were the I call them the Obama-Trump districts, the Democratic sort of DNA districts that either didn't like Hillary or liked President Trump, and there were 12 seats that Republicans held in those sorts of districts. Democrats won 8 of those. It was offset a little bit by the fact that in Minnesota, which is one of the crazier states in this election, Republicans traded away 2 suburban seats and picked up 2 rural seats, and that was again in those Obama-Trump sort of districts. But after that 30 or so, you get into some interesting ones. I think the bigger surprises in this election were in those suburbs. Even in the red states, the suburbs were acting like the suburbs in the blue states or the purple states. You had Republicans losing in Oklahoma City. You had Republicans losing in suburban Charleston, South Carolina. Salt Lake City, Mia Love looks like she's going to go down. So there's some interesting losses, ones that weren't necessarily on the radar, but the patterns are very similar. And I think the other thing about this election is turnout we expected to be high, but they say that every time. Every election is the most important election. You never know when there's going to be sort of buy-in. This was the highest turnout in a midterm in a century. About half of the voting eligible population turned out, which is wild and interesting. And what we're used to is one party, and often recently Republicans, taking advantage of sort of disparity enthusiasm. In this election, everybody was jacked up. It's just the independents and the sort of swing vote, to the extent it still exists, we're looking to punish the president and Republicans. This is just sort of a visual representation of what it looks like, but when the dust settles, it looks like it's going to be Republicans right around the Mendoza line, around 200, something like a 35-seat majority, but we'll have to see as these final 4 or 5 races are called. And I think when you're, well, I guess I'll take it another step back. For our purposes today, for y'all's purposes, looking at what the House conferences look like in retrospect, I think is really interesting. Out of 435 members of Congress in the House, more than 100 are leaving. That's going to be a whole lot of new faces. But that is a lot of new Democrats coming in, winning seats, but that's also a lot of retirements and open seats that are held by Republicans. So I think something like 90 some new members. The difference there is there were some resignations. So there's some new faces that are technically incumbents, but we just probably haven't worked with a lot. But if you look at things like the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is the bipartisan, about half Republican, half Democrat, 90-member conference, started with 43 Republicans. 18 will come back, 17 lost, 8 retired. So 60% are gone. So your pool of people that seem to be, interested in working towards not only bipartisan solutions but bipartisan energy solutions and that sort of thing is really shrunken and withered significantly. So it's going to be interesting to see among those new members, is there an appetite for those sorts of efforts? It's not entirely clear to me yet, but I think the places where Democrats took back their majority and wrested control from Republicans are the sort of the moderate types that you'd expect to be involved in this sort of an effort. So it's really distilling Republicans down to maybe not the sort of Freedom Caucus wing, although they stay about the same size. So within a 200-seat conference, they have more power. I think the balance of power shifts a little bit to the right. Interestingly, where I think if Republicans somehow managed to hold control, we'd be talking about whether Kevin McCarthy would be able to hold his guys in line. When you're in the minority, it's really easy. All you need is 101 votes, and McCarthy has that in his back pocket. So I think the leadership side of that will take care of itself. It's easy to keep a minority together, as John Boehner knew well, and then found out the hard part is actually keeping a working majority. I think on the Democratic side, it's unclear. These aren't your grandfather's blue dogs. For every Connor Lamb, there's a Katie Porter, and it'll remain to be seen. You're already seeing some of the dynamics within the Democratic caucus, where the recent sit-in in Leader Pelosi's office, led by both climate activists, but also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Congressman-elect from New York. So I think it still remains to be seen how these folks are going to decide to engage in the issues and engage the downtown sort of business community. And I think that's going to be what I'm watching. Is I don't quite know how the new crop and mega freshman class of Democrats are going to be oriented toward and disposed toward business. Committee leadership, I think that's probably the starkest way to look at it. If you're looking at the main committees that we care about, probably trading Greg Walden for Frank Pallone, for instance, on energy and commerce. Ways and Means gavel going from Kevin Brady from Texas to Richie Neal from Western Massachusetts. And those are actually interesting instances where you have chairmen who are well known to the business community, who have actually pretty good working relationships with downtown, and actually pretty good working relationships across the aisle with their ranking member. But it'll be interesting to see, going back to that point of the tension between the messaging and what can actually get done. The first thing that Richie Neal is going to do when he formally takes the gavel is request President Trump's tax returns. So things like that are definitely going to color the broader atmosphere, and I think determine whether things can really get done. That said, Leader Pelosi, I think, has been very careful about sort of putting out a measured approach toward these sorts of things. I think they want to keep it on the rails because they know that overreach could backfire and jeopardize what they can do in the near future. But again, going down this list, science, space, and technology, you're trading Lamar Smith for Eddie Bernice Johnson. Natural resources going from Rob Bishop to Raul Gravalia, head of the Progressive Caucus. Transportation is, and I would put that on the top with Ways, Means, and Energy. Pete DeFazio is a well-respected guy that can work with both sides. You don't have quite the contrast, but I think it's looking at those committee leaderships where the stark contrast starts to come into a pretty sharp relief. And this is, I will bore you with, I don't want to go too death by PowerPoint, but there are some interesting shakeups. Ways and Means is a pretty good indicator. There are like 10 open slots just on the Republican side of the dais. You had 6 people retiring, 4 vulnerable members defeated. And I think that you'll see that throughout a number of these committees, and the shakeups at the top work their way all the way down. So a lot of these new faces will be plugged in different places. The Senate, in contrast to the House, obviously Republicans picked up seats, gained ground, but I still think you have to say Democrats did as well as they possibly could have been expected to do. And this map does a good job of showing that. It looks pretty even, right? Even though Republicans ended up picking up seats, that's a function of Democrats having to defend an unprecedented number of them. The dark ones, again, are pickups. So out of 35 seats, and part of this is a fluke of when you turn over a third of the chamber and have for 200 years, the way that the geography is carved out just happens to be favorable to Republicans this year. And also coming off a wave in 2006, Republicans or Democrats held their ground in 2012. So there's a bunch of these pickups that probably should have happened before that are just sort of coming around here. That's Missouri, that's Indiana, that is North Dakota. The weird one here that I don't think most people expected down the stretch was Florida. And obviously that was just settled, I think, days ago when Bill Nelson conceded. But that was probably the biggest surprise on this map. The other states in the Florida category, like Arizona, like Nevada, actually went towards Democrats. Republicans made their gains in the sort of deep red Trumpier states. But Democrats kept 6 of the 10 Trump states. They won the one Hillary state they were shooting at and picked up one of the Trump states in Arizona. So it was a good night. It was a near miss in Texas. That was an interesting one that had, I think, the legacy of Beto for now will be that he probably elected several Democratic members of Congress down the ticket and a whole host of local officials and judges in Harris County and other suburban counties across the state. But that was a near miss that I think will have interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Just before you leave this, I was wondering if you had any comments on Florida.
I think the massive disparity in terms of the financial investment that Governor Scott was able to make, something like $65 million of his personal fortune poured in versus something like 19 million, I think, in total spending for the Nelson side. So that's one thing. That's what helped keep it competitive. That's something that no national party or party committee or campaign could ever do. It's just such a ridiculous sum of money. And he was getting it at candidate rates, where if this was super PACs and that sort of thing, if this was Sheldon Adelson's checkbook, that wouldn't have gone as far. So that was meaningful and important. I think Bill Nelson, having been there for 46 years in elected office in Florida, but yet not being really well known, certainly hurt him. I think he was probably helped by the fact that Andrew Gillum brought out voters in places that maybe wouldn't have been engaged by the senator himself, or even by Gwen Graham had she been the nominee. So there was some sort of interplay there. But I think what it tells you is, even though Florida demographically has come a long ways, and there are certainly areas for Democrats to have optimism in the future, when their biggest import is snowbirds from the Midwest and from the Northeast, the Villages is getting bigger faster than, the let's say the younger and more diverse electorate is sort of coming online. So that's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. But yeah, the other upshot is they haven't figured anything out in 18 years. It's still a total mess. We've gone from the butterfly ballot to hiding Senate races in the lower left corner that cost them the race. I mean, we wouldn't even be wondering what happened had they designed a ballot in a way that didn't cost them 20-some thousand votes. That too. But Florida is definitely the most interesting one. I think there were a number of races that were closer than you might have expected. Places like Michigan, Debbie Stabenow was not expected to have much of a race, and yet that was, I think, a 6-point race. Sherrod Brown was not expected to have much of a race, again, like a 6-point race. So I think if you scratch the surface, there are some indications that our expectations were a little off there, and you have to feel maybe not great if you're Republicans heading into 2020, but there are things tectonic plates that have shifted in the upper Midwest that are favorable to certainly President Trump and his prospects in 2020. But I guess the interesting thing, if you're Democrats, what you can hang your hat on is Senator Manchin was able to prevail and narrowly in Montana and in West Virginia. You had states that were, overwhelming red Republican Trump states that they were able to hold on. And it was closer than I think people expected on election night, but those in retrospect, very impressive on a night when they were able to run the table in the other competitive states. And this is just how the Senate looks. I think if you're looking at what it means to be in a 53-seat majority versus a 51-seat majority, I think one of them is, number one, they're all sort of healthy. I mean, if you remember how they limped along with a 51 and 52-seat majority throughout 2017, just having a healthy complement is important for them. And when it comes to confirming judges and other nominees, having that breathing room of 2 or 3 seats is really important. And certainly going to be Leader McConnell's focus going forward in the next 2 years. And the other thing is on the committees, the ratios change. And so whereas you only had any one member on your side that wasn't with you could probably kill something in committee, now you've at least got a little bit of breathing room where you can lose somebody and still get things through. And so going back to the Nelson thing, that's actually an interesting one because it created a little bit of a cascade effect of, at least on the ranking member side, the Commerce Committee, Nelson was going to keep his ranking member slot. Well, he's not there anymore. You're probably going to see Maria Cantwell from Washington move over from the Energy Committee to the Commerce Committee. That seems to be in the offing, and it creates an interesting opening at Energy. If you move down the dais, I don't think Bernie Sanders wants to give up his roving mandate as budget chair. The question will be, does Debbie Stabenow want to step away from the Agriculture Committee to take over Energy, and or do Democrats dare give Joe Manchin the gavel over the howls of the environmental community? So that'll be an interesting one to watch. Same thing on the Republican side. John Thune, now that he is a whip, will step away from the Commerce Committee. Roger Wicker from Mississippi will take that one over. There's a bunch of musical chairs like that. Orrin Hatch leaving the chamber opens up finance, so Grassley will move over from judiciary to take that one. That opens up judiciary for for Graham. There will be a number like that. Environmental and Public Works, that's still Barrasso. But there will definitely be some new faces in the leadership on the Senate side.
So going back to Senate Energy, I'm curious if you have any scuttlebutt on the Stabenow versus Manchin.
The way I look at it, I don't have any good scuttlebutt, and my colleagues probably do better. I'm the tax guy, so I'm faking it through some of the energy stuff. I didn't say that out loud, did I? But I think if they can get a farm bill through at the end here, I think that's the capstone for her, and she can justify walking away. But if there's still loose ends, I mean, does she really want to walk away without having done that? I don't know. It's probably pretty conventional wisdom, but that's my read on it. But I think there will definitely be some pressure because I mean that would be I would just get the popcorn and watch and have some fun from the sideline watching if Manchin ended up being the ranking member there.
And I know that Ruth and probably others are aware of the timing, but what is the timing for these decisions in the Senate? Sounds like, and the House, I guess I should say.
Well, so that's actually a good question. So I don't know when the steering committee meets. I'm blanking here, but certainly with the loose ends that need to be tied up here, December 7th is sort of the X date for getting some sort of vehicle going, funding vehicle on which maybe a farm bill would ride on. And so until we see some real movement there, I don't think they have to decide on the ranking member side. I think Republicans will decide at the conference level and have their elections in the meantime, but I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I'm not positive.
So basically, it could extend into early January.
It could extend it, yeah. I mean, until they're actually.
For sure,
I think that's right. And if anybody around here can.
Put you on the spot with that.
No. I just wish I had a better answer.
I remember when I was working for Senator Carper and the Dems took the Senate, and Carper was making his big play to try and get on Finance Committee, and everybody was trying to play the musical chairs, and it was probably. And I was, all elated because I was like, oh, I'm going to get to be the staff director of the Clean Air Climate Change Subcommittee. We're going to do a climate change bill. And so it was maybe a couple weeks after Thanksgiving. So maybe sometime in December when Lieberman's staff let me know that I was not going to have that opportunity and that there was going to be a climate change committee. So I remember that very distinctly. So so they had worked through chairmanships and kind of all of that and gotten to rankings by middle of December. Gotten to subcommittees and all that type of stuff by middle of December. So that I would assume it'll be easier because there probably won't be that much other than the fact that they got to have the musical chairs on the ranking side.
That's a much more satisfying answer. I agree.
Question. There has been a lot of talk about resurrecting the climate select committee in the House side. Was that and has that been done official? Is there still discussion?
It's still being discussed, and I think they're actively fighting it.
I mean,
I don't know. I think it's going to happen.
The real challenge is that the select committee was a workaround dingle, right? And now they don't have a workaround. And so Mr. Palone's sitting there like, why do you need to work around me? And the sit-in was, we want the select committee to have legislative authority. And you're like, so so it's a real, I don't really know. I mean, there are plenty of climate issues that are cross-cutting, right? And that there's probably some good reasons to have a broader policy discussion. So you're not, is this a tax bill, or is this E&R, or E&C bill or not? But I think presumably Speaker Pelosi she shot that a little too soon before it was kind of thought through, because I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to be. And it's just like starting a fire inside your own caucus before you even get elected. Speaker is, I would have done it differently.
On the speaker's race, could you talk about that? And how does that, how does the inside baseball of, allocating slots on important committees relate to who might oppose her and so forth?
I think you're watching it play out a little bit in terms of how you had a broader list of people that sort of voiced opposition or openness to new leadership, and then you had a much smaller group that was explicitly saying under no circumstances they'll support. And you're watching some of those members be put to the test a little bit, and maybe change their tune completely, maybe introduce some ambiguity. But I think that's certainly part of the leverage. You don't want to be stashed on the at the wrong end of the whatever committee. And I don't know, I sort of view, I come from the more Republican side of the House, but my perspective is you can't beat somebody with nobody. I don't think the floats of the Marcia Fudges of the world, I don't think that there's anything real there. And I think, at the end of the day, it's a question of, do Democrats have a counterpoint to the true, like the Freedom Caucus that would gladly, shiv you on the floor, and be totally willing to do that. And I'm not entirely sure whether that exists, whether there's sort of, whether there's this herbal Tea Party faction that is going to go to those measures, because she can win the caucus vote, no problem. It's kind of like the hypothetical, what the challenge for McCarthy would have been not winning that vote within the conference. It's what happens when you go to the floor. And they have enough of a cushion that, 17 people will get to, the Connor Lambs of the world will get to go vote for whoever they want, or, vote present or what have you, without jeopardizing the majority. I'm very skeptical of the success of any. Certainly some missteps, but I'm skeptical of someone materializing as a consensus pick to because just my understanding of how the sort of constituent parts of the caucus work, she has enough of a hold on the CBC and the Hispanic caucus and the key groups of that nature. Unless there's a total mutiny, I don't see how she, how a challenger mounts an effective charge. But
Haas and I were talking about this morning. Now, I read in Politico, and so that's all. This is just, I'll blame them. But that the 16 members on that is one vote more than she has 15 to lose. So there's, she'll have to. And then there's some others that have said, never, I won't vote for her, but they didn't sign the letter. And Tom and I were talking about this morning, and I said, those people that aren't on the letter are probably going to be able to extract their pound of flesh in terms of committee placements and things of that sort. And then those last 15 are going to have their, they're going to get their flesh pounded in terms of what they'll get out of this. So yeah, she's the iron fist will probably come down pretty hard on that.
Yeah, Liam, I know you're going to talk about it in a minute, but this conversation on the select committee kind of goes to one of your main points, which is, what's the appropriate and beneficial messaging strategy? Yeah. And then, how do you get things done? Because it, to some degree, picking up on what Tom said, this whole idea of an infrastructure subcommittee in many places is meant to be a practical way to address cross-cutting issues, whereas the select committee could or couldn't be that potentially, or may not even be necessary for that. But it brings you to one reason for doing the select committee is messaging and is projecting an agenda. And then there are these countervailing views that, maybe we should just stay far away from that for a while within, you know, the Democratic leadership. And obviously it's not a consensus view. So just back to this topic about how messaging and how is that going to impact things, I think would be really interesting
Absolutely.
to hear you talk about.
My sense, and I'm sort of going again off colleagues, but my sense is you probably do have the select committee return, and I think the value of that is the message, and that they're on firmer political ground in the abstract and talking through these issues and putting Republicans in a position where they look unreasonable or anti-science or what have you. When you start to get into discrete proposals, then it gets thornier when you put something specific out there that when you're playing with live ammunition, I think it's easier to oppose things for any number of reasons. And I mean, I think this is the next slide I was looking at. But when you look at the sort of the referendum and ballot initiatives that that went to voters, you know, Washington State, if you can't pass a carbon tax in Washington State, where you have relatively high incomes, relatively low cost of energy, and, you know, a pretty good green constituency, it lost by 10 points. And obviously these things are easier to do legislatively than maybe putting them to the people, but that's indicative of, I think, the challenge when people like the idea of doing all these things, but when you actually say, okay, well, we're going to tax carbon and put a fee on it, that's when it gets a little trickier. Similarly, there was efforts in Arizona and Nevada to up the renewables portfolio to 50%, I think. In both of those, you guys might know more than I do, but those also fell short. The Colorado effort was more sort of anti-fracking. You couldn't drill within however many thousand feet of certain buildings and that sort of thing, but all of them went down. I think what's interesting is in those states, you elected people that will support those policies. So Jared Polis is going to go in and maybe do things that the voters just sort of shot down. But I think it underscores my thinking, which is there's a value in having sort of a sandbox where you can do your messaging and you know, make these points, hold these hearings without having to worry about the legislative sort of jurisdiction of actually, you know, doing things, I guess. So there you go. Reinstatement of the House Select Committee. I think we're operating on that assumption, but, you know, based on some of the wires she might have tripped, that gets pretty interesting. I do think even in that context, they're going to have to work out what the terms of that debate are. Are we talking about zero carbon? Are we talking about moving to 100% renewables? I don't think that the terms under which we're having that debate have been defined even on the Democratic side. And you know, moving a little bit into the place that I play a little bit more, I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is not going anywhere, but they're going to use the messaging opportunity to, you know, kind of like Republicans did with the Affordable Care Act. They're going to seek to roll back the parts that they find unpopular, make Republicans uncomfortable, and talk about, let's say, ratcheting up the corporate rate and using that $100 billion of each point to pay for priorities. Maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's a middle class tax cut. But they can do things that we know aren't going to happen, at least not this year, but that can, you know, make Republicans take tough votes and underscore the message that they want to be talking about going into 2020.
So two questions on that. So one, I'm curious for your thoughts on this potential infrastructure subcommittee and what that looks like, and whether they just are going to be dealing with gas tax or, you know, and how to fund kind of an infrastructure bill. And then two, if we don't see tax extenders passed in lame duck, do you think there's an effort at Ways and Means to kind of revitalize those or make them, you know, more durable, kind of similar to the PTC and ITC, so we're not continuing to do this 1 year forward, 1 year back thing?
No, I think they're great questions. I think, first of all, with the subcommittee, I've heard mixed appetites for that, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about the Tax Policy Committee, Revenue Subcommittee, however you want to call it. Their jurisdiction is so broad, and if you look at the last few Congresses, you know, they were first focused mostly on healthcare, then they've been mostly focused on tax reform. They've never really devoted any time to sustainable funding mechanisms for infrastructure. And when you have somebody like Earl Blumenauer, who is both on the committee and very engaged on these issues, it seems like it makes sense to have people that are, you know, a self-selective group that is interested in this, wants to find solutions, and can actually, you know, do something with it. Because that's going to be the challenge in any, not just a sort of, you know, big infrastructure bill, but like just funding highways. Like the FAST Act is running out at the end of 2020. And just to get that 5 years, you had to tap every gimmick imaginable between, you know, Federal Reserve surplus accounts and passport fees and craziness just to make the math kind of work if you squint. So I think you are going to have to, they're going to have to talk about gas tax. And I think that's one thing that's important, is switching out Brady for Neil. Neil has always been more open to that idea, but it's always tough because, you know, if you took a poll of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, a gas tax would win by acclamation, and the tax writers just sort of chuckle. They've never really taken to that. I think, and in the background, I didn't put it on here, but in California, they fought over their referendum to maybe roll back the tax cut. There was actually a senator recalled during the primary back in June over the issue. So I think people appreciate the political peril potentially of embracing, on a bipartisan basis, embracing a gas tax heading into an election year. So it's going to be tough, but at the same time, if you're going to get any kind of energy bill done, it's not going to look like what the White House principals put out. It's not going to be financing and 5-to-1 leveraging. It's going to be something that looks more like funding. And the question becomes, okay, what's the appetite for deficit spending? Or are you going to do something to, you know, gas tax hasn't been raised in 25 years. I think that the interesting thing is you have a president who's not a Republican in any meaningful sense, where he has priors or you know, built-in blocks. He would go for, I mean, I think Carper's told the story where he's been in, you know, in meetings with him and like sort of gotten him to agree to raising the gas tax. And not that, I think the interesting thing is the Senate owes him now more than ever before. You've sort of ejected the Jeff Flakes of the world and the Bob Corks of the world, and you have 4 new members that sort of owe him their job. So the Senate will be more sort of hand in glove with the White House. So that said, you know, I think Leader McConnell is very clear on what his priorities are going to be, and infrastructure does not rank up there on the high part of the list. So we'll have to see on that. But going back to your other question, extenders, I do think, I mean, time's sort of running out, and the way Ways and Means is playing games about not putting anything out there, I think hurts the odds of getting anything done. I do think the question becomes whether they can figure their way out of this sort of CR cul-de-sac, work out a long-term underlying funding vehicle. Because if we just kick the can into next year, then we're going to have a moving vehicle early next year, and maybe there's an opportunity for a bigger tax package. I think if something rides in December, it's going to be a light, like, you know, 1-year retroactive extenders, no real changes. But there's other cats and dogs that are sort of out there in the conversation. There's the, you know, removing the caps on the electric vehicle tax credit. There is, I mean, energy storage is always out there. I think it really comes down to, I try to game this out in my head. I don't understand why Democrats have much of an incentive to make any kind of tax deal before the cavalry comes. So to me, I'm trying to figure out, what do they want? What's on that wish list, like on the Schumer wish list? And I don't quite know what the answer to that is, because Republicans are willing to give on pretty much anything if they can get their technicals and things of that nature. So, but it's a problem when you're getting into, I mean, it's Thanksgiving in 2 days, and Ways and Means won't really show their hand. And as far as the Dems are concerned, well, they're not brokering in good faith. And so how are you going to pull together a deal in the next 2 weeks? So, yeah, but I share the question, and I look forward to the new year. And how am I doing on time here? I feel like,
I mean, we're great.
Okay.
Probably have another 10 minutes.
Okay.
A little less than 10 minutes, and so we have to move to our board meeting, but we have a question.
yeah, let's do questions.
And also, sorry, I was not on the microphone. So we have about a little under 10 minutes before the meeting concludes, but it is okay if we share this slide deck.
So,
with folks,
absolutely.
It's a tremendous resource. Thank you very much.
I kind of borrowed. We've done a few of these presentations, sort of mostly tag team, and so I haven't had to speak to right. Some of the issues that are on here, but I have very smart colleagues who have put together what I think is a pretty good deck.
Thank you. So Justin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Liam. When it comes to tax over the next 2 years, if there are things that your constituents like from the Tax Reform Act, what are you suggesting is the 2-year game plan to make sure that if the House flips and something happens in the White House,
It's a really good question.
Your things aren't on the chopping block.
It's a really good question. I think a lot of this is playing sort of affirmative defense in the sense that there's going to be a lot of hearings and oversight related to the the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the process by which it came to be, the aftermath, and how corporations have reacted to it. So I think, you know, it was sort of the same message that has been out there for the last year with the chamber and others trying to get out the message, like the success stories. What are you doing with these? I think my sense is like the 21% corporate rate is permanent, but it's only as permanent as the political will to keep it. And when that's not particularly, if you just poll corporate tax cuts, that's not something that people, you know, particularly like. And it is pretty appealing when Dems can run on, well, we're just gonna turn it up to 24, 25. I think it gets really slippery, and particularly when you have the president indulging in the post-election press conference some adjustments, like ambiguous. He's never going to shut the door on those things, and so I think you need to make sure that that the message is out there, that they're working, that having this certainty in this new code is important, because the minute that you do start going down the road of, let's say, 2021, when there's a different balance of power, and these sort of the sort of pretend repeal and replace becomes a real thing, I think that's the risk. And you can't do the long-term planning if you're having to you know, try to hold on for dear life. But in terms of an actual plan, I mean, I think it's a messaging thing as much as anything else. The corporate rate's going to be a big piece of it, but the other pieces of the law I think that I'm watching that I'm most concerned about are particularly for small business and pass-through heavy industries. Like MLPs and that sort of thing are also caught up in it. But in 6 years, you're not going to have the 199A deduction if nothing happens. You're going to have to build serious support for the new sections of the code, particularly 199A in that case. Why it's important, why it affects, you know, regular people, why it's not just handouts for millionaires. So I think having a good ready answer for buybacks versus capital expenditures and hiring and that kind of thing, because that's going to be one of the immediate places they go. Why you know, picking and choosing winners and losers on specified services is going to be a key. But I think it depends on the section, but I think there's going to be anything that smacks of being something that helps President Trump run his business enterprises, or people like him are going to be targets. And so I think that's the way I would think through it. If it's anything that helps real estate or helps, could conceivably help the Trump family and their finances, I think that is going to be have a big fat target on it.
I'll throw one kind of curveball in there. I think that I love that yeah, the way you framed it. Like that, 116 is about, you know, messaging and preparing for the 117th Congress. And if you spend the 116th Congress talking about the lack of spending on infrastructure, talking about the deficit holes that were formed by the tax bill, and some of these really big, you kind of want to say that define the problem. And if you do get a wave in 2020, you know, where you have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, one could see a rather, at least when you wave your hands at it, an elegant solution of a carbon tax that can pay for the deficit, that can pay for infrastructure, that can pay for, you know, all these different things, and you can tick off, we took care of climate, we took care of tax, we took care of this, and that one could see kind of a la Bill Clinton 1993 BTU taxes, like that's part of the first 100 days big push to try to change this equation, and maybe it would probably end up the same place as the BTU tax, but I could see that being kind of the trajectory when you're trying to think through all these moving pieces. And real quick, just for a commercial for EC Map on the gas tax, you know, one of the gas tax challenges is fewer gasoline cars and more fuel efficient cars. And there's a big, there's a growing drumbeat about, it's a user fee. And so all the users, whether they're electric or gas or diesel or fuel cell or hydrogen, need to be paying. And that brings the conversation back to VMT, which has always had a big challenge in terms of, do we know how many vehicles are people going to put out where they've been driving? Are we tracking individuals? All those type of challenges. If you have a car that connects to the internet, your car manufacturer knows how many miles you travel, knows where you go. Like all of your car uploads all of your data to a car manufacturer. And so there's, so that will come into the whole conversations about how one can utilize data without it being individualized in a car manufacturer, just like they have to do their CAFE standards kind of based on what they sell. One could see a tax based on them saying all of our cars have driven this far this year. And having a tax assessed like that gets then divvied up amongst new cars. So this is one of those things where digital technologies and the public policy tools and opportunities can be kind of starting to think through that we don't have to just keep doing things the way we did 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. That we have some technologies and trying to figure out the best way to use them.
Well, just very briefly, the last question. I mean, the council and many of us around the table spent a lot of time in the past year focused on disaster recovery and kind of the resilience side. Congress has spent upwards $300, $400 billion. We may be spending more after the wildfires. I mean, it's just really devastating. It may not have anything to do with the election, but just how do you see those issues playing into the next Congress, either party, or they could fit into infrastructure, they could fit into appropriations or additional supplemental bills. But that's been an area where our whole focus has been, this would be something for ECMAP to look at too, which you probably are, because it's not just about technology, but how do we spend those dollars better and protect communities and make more resilient infrastructure?
Yeah, I think I look at it, the real question there is, do you see the sort of quiet continuation of the appropriations process sort of staying on the rails? Does that continue? I think the incentives were there heading to the election because nobody wanted to screw anything up. Nobody wanted to shut down the government because nobody saw the political benefit. I think when you're getting into this next Congress, it's not entirely clear who thinks they might be able to benefit or whether the president just sort of wakes up one morning and decides that he wants to shut things down. If you can align the tension with the border wall, which isn't, those are different funding streams and probably not related to these disaster relief buckets. But if you can sort of avoid this December landmine, you have a good working relationship among your appropriators. And so I think that's a good sign for sort of continued functionality. Like this is the bare minimum that Congress should be doing, just keeping the lights on. But the fact that they were able to sign 5 of them into law before September 30th that's something to build on. And I think divided government could potentially help that to the extent that people aren't trying to become sort of political heroes and shut things down. I guess is there a Democratic Ted Cruz out there? I don't think so, but I think it's a question of whether anybody sees a gain in a shutdown. And if not, then I think that's a good sign for appropriations and for anything that might be riding on it.
Oh, thank you very much. This has been fascinating and interesting, and look forward to 2019.